Morning, a quiet suburb in Boston. Pristine lawns, white picket fences, perfect silence. But on the corner, a nightmare. Peeling paint, shattered windows, a yard choked with dry weeds. The neighbors call it the worst house on the block. One day, an old pickup truck stops in front. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, steps out with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. Neighbors watch through their curtains. "He bought that place?" One man sneers, "Must be all he can afford." Daniel opens the front door and says nothing. Months later, the neighborhood realizes he didn't just buy a house. Watch. The truth is here. Stand by. Now. Believe. Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic precision. At 41, his face was a map of quiet focus and the deep, enduring weariness of a man who worked with his hands to keep a small world safe. He was a professional repairman, a master of all trades, who could fix a structural beam with the same grace he used to solder a circuit board. But to the residents of Pineview Terrace, he was just the guy in the faded denim jacket driving a truck that rattled when it turned the corner. Daniel was a single father. 5 years ago, his world had been surgically hollowed out when his wife, Sarah, passed away after a brave but exhausting battle with illness. In the aftermath, Daniel had spent years in a cramped, soulless apartment in the city, working 3 jobs to pay off mounting medical debts. He lived in the shadows, a ghost in a concrete jungle, working while the world slept. He remembered nights standing on a balcony overlooking the city, feeling like a tiny gear in a machine that didn't care if he broke. But as Emma turned 9, he looked at her eyes, filled with her mother's spark, and realized she needed more than just a roof. She needed a foundation. She needed a place where she could see things grow, and where the air didn't smell like subway exhaust and cold indifference. He had saved every cent, skipped every luxury, and spent his nights scouring real estate listings for a miracle. He found it at 402 Maple Street. It was a Victorian house that had once been the crown jewel of the neighborhood, but 30 years of neglect had turned it into a ghost. The porch was sagging like an exhausted smile. The windows were boarded up with mismatched plywood. The garden was a jungle of thorns and rusted scrap metal. Inside, the wallpaper was peeling like dead skin, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of history. It was the kind of house that lowered the property value of every home within 3 blocks. To the neighborhood association, it was an eyesore. To the investors, it was a liability. To Daniel Brooks, it was an opportunity to build a legacy out of wreckage. He bought it in cash, every penny of his life savings, plus the small insurance policy Sarah had left behind. He didn't want a mortgage. He wanted a home that belonged to them entirely, from the dirt up. When the sold sign went up, the neighborhood WhatsApp group exploded. Who would buy that dump? Is it a developer? Are they tearing it down? I saw a man and a little girl. They look unrefined. This is going to be a disaster for our property taxes. We should check his background. Daniel didn't join the group. He didn't introduce himself at the local organic bakery. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a toolbox that looked older than the house and a truck bed full of lumber. Emma jumped out of the passenger seat, clutching a small box of sunflower seeds and a bright yellow watering can. She looked at the towering, decrepit structure with wide, unshielded wonder. "Dad," she whispered, looking at a shutter hanging by a single rusted screw. "Why this house? It looks sad, like it's lonely." Daniel knelt down in the tall grass, his hand resting on the porch's rotting wood. He wasn't just touching the surface. He was feeling the bones of the building, the solid oak frame, the high ceilings, the way the sunlight hit the roof even through the grime. He remembered his days as a structural engineer before the world got heavy, back when he used to design skyscrapers in Chicago. He knew how to see the strength beneath the decay. He knew that if the bones were good, the skin could be fixed. "Because it still has a chance, Emma," Daniel replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Most people only see the broken windows. They see the mess. But if you look at the foundation, it's still strong. It's like people, pal. Sometimes you just need someone to stay long enough to fix the parts that hurt. We aren't just moving into a house, we're going to bring it back to life, and maybe it'll do the same for us. Act 1 was the arrival of the outsider, a man who chose the hardest path because he believed in the invisible strength of things. The neighbors watched from behind their expensive, triple-glazed windows. They saw a man who couldn't afford a real house. They didn't see the architect of a new kind of community. They didn't know that Daniel Brooks wasn't just fixing a roof. He was preparing to teach an entire street how to care again. He was the ghost of Maple Street, starting a revolution with a hammer and a prayer. The first month was a symphony of manual labor and judgmental glares. Daniel worked a 10-hour shift at his regular maintenance job, then spent every evening under the harsh glow of portable work lights, hammering away at the Victorian skeleton. The sound of his circular saw became the unwanted heartbeat of the block. Mr. Henderson, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic and a retired hedge fund manager, lived across the street. He spent his afternoons leaning on his perfectly manicured hedge, watching Daniel with a clinical, disapproving gaze. "He'll give up by July," Henderson told the mailman, loud enough for Daniel to hear. "That roof needs a full tear-off. That's a $50,000 job. Look at him. He's doing it with a crowbar and a ladder. He doesn't know the first thing about the character of this neighborhood. He's going to leave a half-finished wreck on our corner for the next 5 years. Mark my words. He's lowering the value of my retirement," the neighbors whispered as they walked their designer dogs. They saw Emma in the front yard, her knees covered in dirt, helping her father sort through piles of salvaged bricks. They saw a father and daughter eating sandwiches on the porch steps because the kitchen didn't have a floor yet. To the polished families of Boston's suburbs, this looked like a tragedy. They saw poverty. They saw a struggle they wanted no part of. They even sent an anonymous letter to the Homeowners Association, HOA, claiming the noise and aesthetic disturbance was violating the community standards. One rainy Thursday night, the roof leaked. Daniel spent 6 hours in the dark, balanced on a slick ladder, duct taping heavy plastic sheeting over the gaps while the wind tried to throw him off. He was shivering, his hands numb, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Through the window, he saw Emma sleeping in her sleeping bag on the only dry patch of floor. That was his fuel. Daniel never responded to the whispers or the letters. When Mrs. Gable, the local gossip who prided herself on her flower arrangements, walked by and asked, "Don't you think it would be easier to just buy a prefab in the valley?" Daniel simply offered a polite nod, his eyes focused on the level in his hand. "Easier isn't always better, ma'am," he said before disappearing back into a cloud of white plaster dust. He was a master of the small victory. One week, it was the front door, a massive slab of mahogany he spent 40 hours stripping and staining until it glowed like a gemstone. The next week, it was the stained glass above the entryway, which he painstakingly repaired with leaden patience, piece by tiny piece. He worked until his hands bled, then taped them up and kept going. Emma was his shadow. She wasn't just playing in the dirt. She was learning the value of the effort. She helped him paint the trim. She learned how to use a level and how to hold the lights steady when the sun went down. She drew chalk diagrams on the sidewalk, explaining to the squirrels how they were going to save the dragon, which was her nickname for the house. And in the corner of the lot, where the weeds had once been 6 feet high, she cleared a small square of earth. Every evening, she watered her sunflower seeds, talking to them as if they were the house's only friends. "Is the house happy yet, Dad?" she asked one night, her face smudged with white primer, her eyes reflecting the work light. Daniel looked up from the floor joists. He was exhausted. His back ached with a dull, persistent fire, and his bank account was almost empty. But he looked at the door he had finished, and then at the girl who was finally laughing again, and he felt richer than he ever had in the city. "It's getting there, Emma. It's starting to breathe again. You can hear it, can't you? The house is thanking us. It's a quiet thank you, but it's there." But the neighborhood remained cold. The HOA sent a code enforcement officer twice in 3 weeks. They were looking for a reason to fine him, to force him out. They expected a man who would fold under the pressure of legal jargon, but Daniel showed the officer his permits, his safety logs, and his structural certifications. The officer, a veteran of 30 years, was stunned by the precision of the work. "You're doing this all yourself?" the officer asked, looking at the perfectly aligned electrical conduits. "I've seen professional crews do worse work than this. Your wiring it's artistic." "Just me and my supervisor," Daniel winked, nodding toward Emma, who was busy organizing his screwdrivers by size and color. The skepticism of the street was a wall thicker than the Victorians' bricks. People assumed that because he was a contractor, he was unrefined. They assumed that because he was a single dad, he was failing his daughter by not giving her a perfect home immediately. They were so focused on the noise of his hammer that they missed the melody of the change. They were waiting for him to fail, unaware that Daniel Brooks had already survived the worst failure a man can face. And he wasn't afraid of a few rotten boards. He was building a masterpiece, but he was doing it one screw at a time, hidden behind a veil of dust and doubt. By the third month, the house had transitioned from a wreck to a project. The sagging porch was now a sturdy, elegant structure with white railings that gleamed in the afternoon sun. But then Daniel did something that made the neighborhood freeze. He didn't stop at his property line. One Saturday morning, Daniel was out at 6 a.m. with a power washer, but he wasn't cleaning his own siding. He was cleaning the public sidewalk in front of his house. And then he kept going. He cleaned the sidewalk in front of Mr. Henderson's house. He cleaned the curb. He spent 4 hours erasing 10 years of city grime and moss from the path the school children took every morning. Mr. Henderson walked out, confused and holding a cup of expensive coffee. "Hey, what are you doing? I didn't ask for a service. I'm not paying for this. This is city property." Daniel didn't stop the machine. He just gestured to the sparkling concrete. "It makes the walk to the bus stop safer for the kids, sir." The moss was getting slippery in the rain. "No charge. I had the equipment out anyway. Might as well make the whole block shine." He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just finished the job and went back to his own porch. A week later, the Gable house next door had a fence that had been leaning for 3 years. Mrs. Gable had been complaining about the cost of repairs for months, blaming the local wildlife for the damage. One evening, after finishing his work on the Victorians' plumbing, Daniel walked over with his impact driver and a handful of galvanized screws. In 20 minutes, the fence was straight and solid. When Mrs. Gable came out to investigate the noise, Daniel was already walking back to his yard. "I saw it was sagging," he said over his shoulder, his voice as calm as a morning lake. "I had the tools out anyway. Thought I'd tighten it up for you. It'll keep the deer out better now." The pattern began to emerge. Daniel started clearing the weeds from the dead lot, a small, city-owned patch of land next to the Victorian that had become a dumping ground for trash, old tires, and broken glass. He didn't just mow it, he leveled it. He brought in fresh topsoil. He and Emma spent an entire weekend planting hardy perennials and laying down a small gravel path. He installed a simple wooden bench he had built from the house's original salvaged joists. The neighbors were baffled. Why would a man who could barely afford a house spend his precious time and limited resources on land he didn't own? Why would he help the people who had spent months whispering about him behind his back and sending him letters from the HOA? "Why are you doing all this, Daniel?" A younger neighbor, a lawyer named Mark, asked as he watched Daniel repairing a broken street lamp that the city had ignored for months. "You aren't getting paid for this. You're increasing the value of our houses, not just yours. It doesn't make sense from an investment standpoint." Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow with a grease-stained rag, his hazel eyes calm and deep. "Because it matters, Mark. A house is just a box. A neighborhood is a system. If one part of the system is broken, the whole thing feels heavy. I'm not just fixing wood and stone. I'm trying to change the atmosphere. I want Emma to grow up in a place that's worth caring about. You can't put a price on the air you breathe." One evening, a neighbor named Mrs. Gable brought over a plate of cookies, not because she was being nice, but because she wanted to see the inside of the house. Daniel invited her in. She expected to see a construction site. Instead, she saw a home. The wood was glowing. The air smelled of cinnamon. Emma was at a small table, reading a book on architecture. You really have a gift, Daniel," Mrs. Gable whispered, touching the smooth finish of the banister. "It's not a gift, ma'am," Daniel replied. "It's just staying long enough to listen to what the house needs." One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ancient elms, Emma sat with her father on their newly finished porch. The house was now painted a soft, elegant sage green with cream trim. It looked like a postcard from a better time. The dead lot was now a pocket park where birds were starting to return, and the first of Emma's sunflowers were beginning to bloom, their bright yellow heads nodding at the street. "Is this just about our house, Dad?" Emma asked, leaning her head against his arm, watching a neighborhood cat prowl through the new park. Daniel was silent for a few seconds, watching a neighbor, the same one who had once called him a peasant, walk past and hesitate, looking at the new park, then offering a small, shy wave. "No, Emma," Daniel whispered. "It's about the whole street. I wanted you to grow up in a place where people look out for each other, but you can't wait for people to start caring. You have to be the one who starts first. You have to give them a reason to believe it's possible. You have to be the anchor. Once the anchor is set, the rest of the ship stops drifting." He realized that the worst house on the block hadn't been his burden, it had been his bridge. By choosing the most broken thing in the neighborhood, he had earned the right to fix the things that were truly broken. The isolation, the judgment, and the coldness of a street that had forgotten how to be a community. He was the ghost engineer of the human heart, working in the shadows of the renovation to build a foundation that would last long after the paint dried. The neighbors were beginning to see it. They were starting to come out of their houses. They were starting to talk to each other. The ice queen of the suburbs was beginning to melt, and all it had taken was a single dad who wasn't afraid of the dirt or the truth. 6 months had passed. The Victorian at 402 Maple Street was no longer the worst house. It was, without question, the most beautiful home in the district. It radiated a kind of warmth that the modern, sterile mansions across the street couldn't match. It wasn't just the paint, it was the life. One Saturday morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. A young couple and their 2 small children stepped out. They were looking at the house for sale next to Mrs. Gable's, a property that had sat on the market for 18 months with zero interest. The neighbors watched from their porches. They expected the couple to take one look at the area and leave, just like everyone else had. But the woman stopped. She looked at the pocket park Daniel had built. She saw Emma and 2 other neighborhood kids, the Henderson twins, playing tag on the clean, power-wash sidewalk. She saw the perfectly restored Victorian with the bright yellow sunflowers nodding in the breeze. She saw Daniel on his porch, reading a newspaper, looking like he had been there for 100 years. "This neighborhood feels different," the woman said, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "It feels like people here actually care about where they live. Look at this park. Look at that house on the corner. It feels like a home, not just a property. This is exactly where I want our kids to grow up. It feels safe. It feels like a community." They bought the house that afternoon, above the asking price in a bidding war that started within hours. The freeze moment hit the block like a tidal wave of clarity. Mr. Henderson sat on his porch, looking at the street he had lived on for 40 years. He looked at his own lawn, then at the clean curb, then at the man in the sage green house who was currently helping an elderly woman from 3 doors down carry her heavy groceries. He realized that the property values on Maple Street had jumped by 15% in half a year. He realized that the disorderly man he had tried to report to the city was the only reason the street felt alive again. He thought about the letter he had signed to the HOA, and he felt a cold, sharp pang of shame in his chest. He realized he had been guarding a hedge while Daniel was building a village. He didn't just fix his house, Henderson muttered to himself, a lump forming in his throat as he watched his own grandchildren playing in the park Daniel had built on his own dime. "He fixed the street," Mrs. Gable replied, standing at the fence line. She wasn't holding binoculars today. She was holding a tray of warm muffins. "He did more for us than any of our merit-based boards ever did, and he did it while we were laughing at his boots and whispering behind his back. We were the eyesores, Arthur. Not him. We were the ones who were broken." The neighborhood gathered. Not for an HOA meeting to discuss fines, but for a realization. They saw Daniel Brooks not as a poor contractor who bought a dump, but as a visionary who saw the worth in the things they had discarded. They realized that their clean houses were hollow because they hadn't put any work into the between spaces. They had built walls, but Daniel had built a bench. Daniel had used his perceived poverty as a shield and his actual skill as a weapon against their apathy. He had proven that one man, with one hammer and a daughter who believed in sunflowers, could rewrite the destiny of 100 families. The worst house had become the lighthouse. And as the neighbors began to walk toward Daniel's porch, muffins and apologies in hand, the atmosphere of the street changed forever. The silence was gone. The community was finally home. As the sun began to set, casting a golden, liquid glow over the sage-green Victorian, Mr. Henderson walked up the steps to Daniel's porch. Daniel was sitting in a handmade wooden chair he had built from a salvaged oak, watching Emma organize a seed swap with the new family's children in the park next door. "Daniel," Henderson said, his voice unusually soft, almost humble. I owe you an apology. We all do. We thought you were we thought you were buying what you could afford. We thought you were a desperate man who would drag us down. We were so wrong. We were looking at your boots and we missed your heart." Daniel looked at the old man, a faint, peaceful smile touching his lips. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like he wanted an apology. He just looked at peace. "I was buying what I could afford, Mr. Henderson," Daniel replied. "I just value different things than you do. I don't buy things for what they are. I buy them for what they can be. I see the potential in the broken because I've been broken myself." "Why did you really buy this house, Daniel?" Henderson asked, looking at the masterpiece of wood and glass. "You're a brilliant engineer. I saw your old credentials in the city archives. The Chicago Spire Project. You could have taken your skill anywhere. You could have been a high-end flipper in the city and made millions." Daniel turned his gaze back to Emma. She was laughing, her face lit by the setting sun, surrounded by friends she wouldn't have had 6 months ago. He thought about the small apartment and the subway exhaust. He thought about Sarah's final wish, to have a garden where she could hear the birds. "Because I wanted her to grow up somewhere where people care," Daniel replied. "I spent 5 years in a building where I didn't know my neighbor's name. I saw my daughter becoming a ghost, growing up in a vacuum of screens and concrete. I realized that if you want a community, you have to build it. You can't just buy a ticket to one. I bought the broken house because it was the only way to show everyone else that we could fix the broken street. I didn't want a luxury house, Mr. Henderson. I wanted a legacy of belonging. I wanted her to see that the most important view is the one you create for others." Henderson was silent for a long time. He looked at the pocket park, then back at the single dad in the scuffed work boots who had just schooled a hedge fund manager on the true meaning of investment. "You're a hell of an architect, Daniel," Henderson said, offering a firm, respectful handshake. "Not just for the house, for all of us. You reminded us that we're a neighborhood, not just a row of isolated houses. You made us see each other." Daniel smiled and squeezed the man's hand. "The foundation is true now, sir. The rest is just maintenance, and community is the best sealant I know." The story of the cheapest house ended not with a sale or a profit, but with a beginning. Daniel Brooks was no longer the stranger on the corner. He was the anchor. And as the lights of the Victorian flickered on, one by one, the neighborhood of Pineview Terrace finally understood the truth. True value. It isn't found in the price of the paint or the size of the lawn. It's found in the courage to see the chance in a wreck, and the wisdom to know that when you build a home for yourself, you are actually building a future for everyone around you. Daniel and Emma were finally home. The ghost was gone, replaced by a lighthouse, and for the first time in 30 years, the street was perfect. Not because the paint was new, but because the hearts were open. The dragon was saved, and the sun would always shine on Maple Street. Real wealth is not measured by the luxury of your possessions, but by the strength of the community you create through your actions. Never underestimate the power of a single person to restore the soul of a place All it takes is the willingness to see the potential in the broken and the heart to stay until it's fixed. Character is the only architecture that never fades, and a home is only truly finished when it opens its doors to the world. If you believe that one person can change an entire community, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, would you choose the hardest path if you knew it would make things better for everyone?